Hello, psychology students. Instructor Anderson here for week 3. I know this video is a little bit late, but take this as if you're midway through working on some of the things, if you're wanting some just additional information as you guide yourself through this learning for this week, that is good. And sometimes I've watched or I've done summary videos too to summarize some of the key points, as we build each week as well. So I'm going to go over just some of the key pieces in the chapter since it is not exactly right at the beginning of the chapter. I probably won't go over, I'll go over the learning guide. I won't go over everything in detail just for the fact that you might have done some of this already. But again, this week we are working with sensation and perception, the Gestalt principles of perception, classic and operant conditioning, and then observational learning. And so I'm just going to touch on some of the things in each one of those for you this week. So in the Gestalt, not the Gestalt, in the learning objectives, excuse me, those keywords right here, as you know, you should be examining, analyzing, evaluating, explaining, and describing. Here are your tasks, and you'll notice this week there is no learning journal, which is, it can be beneficial, number one, because you have all these other written assignments and writing assignments, discussion posts. It's been fantastic reading through your discussion posts, the amount of information, learning that is happening with placing your information out in the discussion forum from what I had posted, right, and seeing where you're taken off from there. I think that is the beauty of anything that we work with about that. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6, those are some summaries of what is going to go on as well. And the key piece, and if you go further into your masters, especially with Gestalt theories, that is a big part of perception and how we perceive challenges in our lives, and how there's actually Gestalt therapy that works to help us understand the world around us, right? And it is a form of psychotherapy, and it is increasing the person's awareness. I was having a mental block there, an increase in people's awareness. So when you think about it, when you start thinking about perception, what perception is, right? Well, we see the world around us. What are we seeing with the world around us? And that, to me, is the best part of general psychology, is because you get to kind of see these terms and how they then kind of expand right beyond that broad and more of that foundational approach as well. If you've ever heard of the word self-direction, that is under a social emotional learning, and that is something to how we as people work to be better versions of ourselves. And when we have self-direction, right, it is putting ourselves in those steps in front of us, right? And where we're right now and what that's going to take us into the future. It is not about looking behind us. And so really we can go, I guess I don't want to go too much on a tangent with the Gestalt theory and the Gestalt therapy, but awareness, right? That is where we're going to be headed to with that. All right. And here's your reading information for the week as well, and your discussion assignment. If you're not already in the discussion assignment, make sure you're going into the discussion assignment as well. Pause the video if you need to. And then here is your written assignment. There are multiple parts, and making sure that you're, answering all of those key pieces for the writing assignment, all right? And I cannot emphasize enough that the working on citations is really, really important when we start talking about the APA format, what we're doing in terms of how we cite, why do we cite, where do we cite, right? And it's all about putting your original work, but matching what is out there in your reading. I expect you, when you're doing your learning journal specifically, is to take the information, the assigned chapters, right, and then making sure that you're taking those ideas, citing it correctly, but connecting why you feel, what you feel, how you feel, why you feel, right? Connecting your own ideas, your thoughts, right? But then taking those, right, from the readings. So it's important that you properly cite that as well. And in this information, you'll notice that it takes some time to look through it. It is absolutely something that I think is going to be beneficial for you. Excuse me. So when we talk about sensation, when we talk about perception and sensation, I think actually I'm going to stop. Here, what am I doing? I'm going to stop my share, and then I'm going to share a different screen. I'm going to share my PowerPoint here, and it's not much of a not a big PowerPoint, um, but nevertheless, it is absolutely something I think that I'm actually going to write some things as we do this. Okay. So here we go. So what is sensation? What is perception? Sensation is really the simulation, right, of the sense, right? We talk about our senses, right, and how we feel, what we do with those feelings, and the perception is really that how we feel and what we're going to do with those feelings. Okay, that is really important. I think that is key in our understanding of this topic. And we talked a little bit about the Gestalt principles perception, just slightly. But again, I want you to think about that awareness, self-awareness, self-direction as we go into this information as well, right? And so when we think about the visual system, when we think about the essentials of sight, think about that with this, right? So I'm going to see if I can annotate when I do this. So think about, and I apologize if my mic's making noises. But when we think about our sight, right, we think about, our eyes. So when we see, we process that information. It goes into our brains. Our brains say, this is what's happening. Okay, this is what's happening. So it's a very foundational idea of psychology, because as we go into the chapter, as you go into into psychology, you're going to go into the lifespan of young people, lifespan development. You're going to go into the various theories, learning theories, right? You're going to go into how we create emotions around our levels of awareness. So when we see, when we look, we take that information in, our brain processes it. Okay. And then we perceive that. What does that mean by perceive? Okay. Well, it all has to do with a lot of that makeup of our bodies. Now I'm not going to go into the human eye and talking about the human eye and the lens and the structure of the lens, right? Talking about nearsightedness. But it's important in how and your reading is going to do a lot of it, right? And we can go into the biological aspect of it with the dark and light adaptation, right? When we're in a dark room or in a light room, when we're saving, how we connect. Sensation and perception cover, right? The I guess you could say the visual pathways to the brain and what our brain is doing to process that information. Okay. But I love the idea when we can go further into when we start thinking about color, right? We think about the various colors. When we go into a red room, we go into a blue room. What is it? What are we doing with that? How is our brain processing that? Then it starts connecting to, we could go into how that makes us feel, how we look at that. We could actually go into the animals, right? And talking about the behavior of colors with animals, humans, right? There's actually research around colors and behavior, right, that have on psychological functioning. Okay. So there's literature out there. We're not going to get too much into it, but it amazes me to think that when we think of red, think about the color red, right? There is actually research out there about red and how that triggers some our senses of hunger, right? We can look at the red. There's actually, let me step back a little bit. There's actually a study. Oh, excuse me. There's actually a study, right, around the behavioral effects of color. And they said that red is actually associated, I put in my notes out here, is associated with danger or the failure in achievement settings. So they actually had they talked about how red, right, has this negative impact. So when we start studying that, we start connecting and how our brain is looking at these colors and how it's processing, how it's making us behave, have actions around those colors. So when we think about sensation and perception, that's exactly why it's important to talk about in psychology. Okay. So when we think about the whole picture, and again, I'm only covering a very small fraction of the introduction of this, but I think there's some key points just to bring up just from my perspective. And being a video, it's sometimes hard to go further into that. But when we talk about linear perspective, when we talk about texture gradient, when we talk about the size, the relative size of an object, right? The ways and terms of um, the depth of the picture, the way we connect the different colors, right? That can help us understand in which how the brain processes through the eyes and how much the eyes are powerful in terms of how we feel, what we feel. So think about this. Think about looking at a sunset. Think about a sunset, driving out there, what it makes you feel, right? Just kind of thinking about that. That's kind of basic psychology, right? When we think about the if you looked at an image where it's there's holes and there's just the concave shapes and there's these various patterns, how it makes you feel, what it does to us, right? So that is just a simple look at that. But again, it is definitely important and perceiving that information, right? When we talk about not only sight, we're talking about sight, we're talking about other senses as well. Touch, right? The sensory systems in the skin. If you've ever, you have the skin right here, and if you've ever gotten poked, this is kind of a stinger, right? How does that feel? What that pain, right? It sends pain. Um, our body says, "Ouch, this hurts," right? Obviously, our body can react in such ways. But again, it's important in terms of understanding how that is all connected to our brain and what our bodies do, how we act upon that, what we say beyond that as well. What do you say when you're stung, right? What do you do? What are your actions when you are stung as well? All right. I didn't want to go too much into that. I think that is important. Again, seeing the vision is not the only, right, is not the only um, way of seeing it or having a sense, excuse me. We have the hearing, right? What music does to the soul. They've talked about music and studying music for emotions. And when I used to, with last year, I remember having music in my room, just calming kind of jazz music. When students would come in, they would be in this high um, emotion, not able to regulate their emotions. They would come in and then they would, especially with the lighting I had, right? It was calm. It wasn't this bright light, which brought kind of this high energy. It was a calm setting with some essential oils, right? And some music. So we're talking about senses. In that situation, I had some lavender oils, right? Smell. I have the nice calming light, right? The sight. I had the music. We talk about the auditory, right? I had sand, right? Some sand. It was like a foam alive sand. It was the students would play with that, touch that, and before you know it, they were able to find that regulation, right, within themselves. They were able to kind of have um, that wise mind away from that emotion mind. So that's why it is so important when we talk about when we talk about excuse me, uh, the senses, perception. All right. All right. So classical conditioning, I'm just going to brief through this really quick. And I say that a lot. I say quick, but again, feel free to pause the video. This is really fun. And I say fun to the point where, it can only get so fun when we're via video. But when it's a topic that I really, really enjoy teaching, it's a lot of fun. So classical conditioning, conditioning itself, when we think about, I'm going to actually annotate here again. When we think about conditioning, oops, said Daisy, hold on. There we go. So when we talk about conditioning, I'm going to put COND, that involves the associations of learning, right, between events that occur around yourself. So again, learning what happens in this environment, right? You see something, you hear it, you experience it, right? Okay. What is happening within that specific experience, right? And I think that's important because Ivan Pavlov is pretty significant, right, in conditioning. Okay. And he did Pavlov's theory, demonstrated the reflexes of dogs, talked about the response of dogs, and with dogs, excuse me. And I would encourage you to further explore that if you haven't known about that as well. But it is an amazing experience when we think about how we as individuals, right, in our world, I guess you could say, right, how when we think about our own selves. So think about this. Think about our simple responses to situations, right? So when you think of a situation in your life, think about how you respond. Anywhere from with fear and anxiety. When we think about our responses, so when we think about this, this is actually operant conditioning. Sorry. This, I want to make sure you understand this was supposed to be classical conditioning, but I'm just focusing on conditioning, classical conditioning. So don't get confused. I wanted to make sure that I did that. I don't know how. There we go. I might have pressed that during that too. I'm sorry. So when we think about, again, the whole time I've been talking about classical conditioning, my friends. All right. So when we think about fear and anxiety, think about fear. All right. I'm going to just make sure I annotate with that. Fear and anxiety. Think about how you feel. Okay. Think about how you feel with those situations. Try to play back. Phobias, for example, are a good example when we talk about in psychology because, right, there are responses, right? When we think about fears around something, there is a reason why those have been created because of an experience, right? Because of something that may have happened. Now, for example, my wife got in a car accident. She's fine. She's safe. Because it was such a traumatic, for her, it was traumatic. You can actually develop post-traumatic stress disorder from those situations because of the impact it had on herself, literally on her car, with a few of our kids in there. Luckily, they were safe. We just are thankful for that. When she stepped back into a car about a week later, she had this overwhelming feeling, this flashback of reoccurring, like this is what happened. This happened in a car. I'm sitting in a car right now, right? It is a way that can develop because of those conditions, right? Those emotional responses. Think about those emotional responses, right? That happen because of what occurred right in that car. I was losing my train of thought. So there's actually research around immune response, because when we think about stress, stress has a negative stress, right? Um, Distress. It has a lot to do with and if you've ever taken health psychology, there's a lot to do with how stress affects our body. Stress affects our immune system, our digestive system, everything, right? But there's actually research around classical conditioning of immune suppression. So when when it when an event happens, right, such as something traumatic, something that subject's fearful, right? Maybe even going to the dentist. Everyday anxiety responses, not doesn't have to be this large fear, but everyday experiences, right? Um, because of maybe some situation that happened years ago, we think about that, we associate with that, we experience it, we have repeated these repeated emotions, we feel pain, we know what pain does, we know what pain will do to us, right? When you're constantly thinking and thinking and thinking of that, right? What is that doing? Your mind is sometimes in overdrive. What that does is it puts your body in this heightened um really a level of awareness, and awareness that is not always healthy, right? It's almost like your car can take so much. Your car, when you drive your car, it can take so much, can take so much, um, take so much of a beating. But if you go without giving it oil change, it is going to, right? It is going to die. It is going to, and I'm not saying that associated with people, but what I'm saying is the immune system, right? The engine will really essentially break. The response of everything around in the car will overheat. I mean, so it could be apples to oranges in describing that, but it all has to do with classical conditioning. Okay, there is so much when we think about classical conditioning. Um, there is it is a mechanical process. So think about this as a mechanical process. Okay. So when I think of the car example, right? Classical conditioning is a mechanical process. Okay. That leads to a result. Okay. So that view reflects the fact that most, I guess you could say, most conditioned responses are reflective. Okay. And sometimes difficult to control. So when you go back to the fear and anxiety, so in your book, you'll read about Pavlov, and there was a situation with his experiments that Pavlov's dogs, right, would in the situation that they were dealing with the reward system and the treats, the food, excuse me, um, would have been hard pressed to withhold, right, their response system to that. So when you go and talk about that, um, there might be this outcome that we want to see, but in itself, um, sometimes there's these repeated responses of our bodies. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go on to the other one. Again, I feel like sometimes I would like to talk about more. There is so much more. We could talk about B.F. Skinner. We could talk about stimulus discrimination. There is so much within um, within classical conditioning, but it's important to, yeah, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement. I'm just going through all of my notes here as well. And your discussions that I've been reading so far about positive and negative consequences of those talking about punishment and reinforcement are powerful. And that has so much to do with when we talk about um, classical conditioning, and then into operant conditioning as well. And I think it's important that you that you work to make sure you're connecting those ideas. So um, the operant conditioning, as you know, goes into I'm going to actually go to the next screen here. I'm going to actually clear this. And let's go to the next screen here. And the reason I'm going to go to this next screen is because I just want to make sure I write with the association or the associated with what we have on the screen, excuse me. All right, so let me annotate really quick here. So as you know, that operant conditioning is going to be, you could say it's a method of learning, right? It is a method of learning, okay? We talked about conditioning itself as learning in our environments. That we talk about punishment, right? And then we talk about rewards. And when we talk about that, it is to talk really to modify, right? When we talk about we see a behavior, we see something happen, right? We are going to work to change that, okay? So when we talk about classical conditioning, right, that is just our experiences as kind of a foundational approach to that, right? But Albert Bandura once said that most human behaviors is learned by observation through modeling. And so that's going to be a good point as we go into observational learning. And I want you to think about the reason I said that right now is because I want you to think about that and how we portray maybe the way we teach people around us, how we view behaviors now maybe versus in the past, how we maybe as parents, maybe as educators, right? What you would do, how you would respond to that discussion assignment. What is the reasoning why, right? What is the reasoning why? So punishment and rewards, I'm not going to go too much into detail about this as well. And it is important to know the reasoning why this has been there because of how it has been portrayed through the observations of animals. When something is presented, right? You have a mouse, for example, and you have the mouse, for example, in a cage, and they press the lever, right? That is going to be the behavior. And when that lever is pressed, right, there could be a piece of cheese in there. Okay, right? So positive reinforcement behavior. So in that positive reinforcement, we know that that's the behavior, the cheese there, the consequences really that the reward is presented, right? The cheese is there. So when we think about effect on behavior or the modification, right, that mouse is going to have the tendency to do what? Continue to press that lever. But in the opposite end, when we think about operant conditioning, we think about the negative reinforcement and the behavior, right? The response, they press the lever, boom. The negative reinforcement in the behavior was actually pressing the lever, right? But then that negative reinforcement is going to be what? No cheese, no food. It's empty. Okay. In this situation, one of the experiments, the effect on behavior because of the tendency to press the lever increased at one point, and the new behavior, the new enforcement was in there with no cheese. They added a consequence in one of the experiments saying that that there was a shock that happened to that mouse. So it's important. It's important to work to understand this because, again, you might not become experts on it. By golly, I am not an expert in all the psychology topics. There are some things like, emotion, memory, learning. Those are things that I really like to go into versus kind of their basic operant conditioning. Those are things that they're there, and it's important to learn it and understand it. But again, if you feel, and I guess my point with that is if you feel unsure about stuff, if you're not really sure, that is a okay. Again, continue to work yourself in those next one. So when we think about really quick is observational learning. Observational learning is behavior that is learned, right? We simply that, but it's learned through watching others. It's learned through the replication of others as well, right? And it is an organism, it is a person, it is an animal that is responsive, excuse me, right, because of the influence by, right, those models, those things around them, those actions around them, and where, right, whereas when we think about conditioning, right, is that a direct experience, right, that you lived it, but in observational learning, you're more so, right, you're looking, right, you're observing, you're watching, you're wondering, right, you're Albert Bandura talked about, right, um, with classical and operant conditioning that can actually take place vicariously through observational learning. Okay. When we see a son um, learning how to shave for the first time, right? Um, Actually, this is kind of cool. So when we think about observational learning, it occurs in both the humans and the animals, right? We talked about that. No one really trained um, animals to do certain things, right? Right. There is an experiment. I should have stepped back. Sorry. Um, Sometimes my thoughts get ahead of me. There was a picture of an animal, a dog specifically, praying with a priest, right? And so in that, right, no one really trained that, but the dog was actually, right, picked it up through responses by observing, by watching the priest. Just like children watch their fathers maybe shave for the first time. Maybe they watch their mothers and how they cook and handle how to do the stove, or their mothers fixing a tire, or their dad's cooking. Right? We like to have those dual roles. That's okay. That's important. So it's important to be able to understand that. All right. So I hope that I'm going to actually stop sharing. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Again, I tend not to, I try not to go too much on a tangent, but there's so much to learn in an exciting topic because um, if you look in the information of your book, I mean, there's so much information about that, and I think it's important that we take notes. You take notes, but again, I feel like a lot of you understanding this based on all the posts that I've read so far. I think that you're understanding exactly where we fall in terms of meeting those objectives of general psychology. And if you have any questions, make sure you follow up as well. All right. Take care, everybody. Have a good one. Good one.